Thanks so much for that introduction, Boris. Sorry not to be able to visit in person, not least because I have such good memories. The last time I was up there, about 9 years ago. And as I get started, I also want to acknowledge, with respect, the Lenni Lenape peoples on whose traditional territory Rutgers University stands. So the world is filled with an incredible diversity of species, from microbes to plants, insects to birds, squids to people. But all these species have to cope with changes in their environment, both through time and across space, whether that's temperature or water, nutrients, light. And some of the fascinating questions include how, where, when, and whether a population or species can persist with this environmental variation. It's also a time of rapid environmental change, whether temperature over the last 150 years, as I'm showing you here, or the many other aspects of global change driven by humans right now. And a major challenge for biologists is to understand the relevant processes well enough to predict the consequences for species and ecosystems going forward. So on one level, organisms have an amazing diversity of ways to cope with environmental change and variation. So a certain amount is just tolerable from a physiological point of view with little impact on fitness. Beyond that, behavior allows organisms to avoid stressful conditions, while acclimation and plasticity allow for changes in tolerance over slightly longer timescales. And then over generations, evolution can cause a population over generations, evolution can rescue a population faced with stressful conditions. But if conditions in one location are unsuitable, an alternative is to expand into new territory with more suitable conditions. And if none of these mechanisms are successful, extinction results. On top of this, we aren't just talking about a single species, but actually entire communities of species responding, interacting, and affecting each other. So changing interactions among species can also feed back to affect any of these processes. We can think of these as mechanisms spread across axes of time, of space, and also of biological organization, from individual organisms to populations to communities. And while our understanding at each of these levels has been improving rapidly, we haven't integrated knowledge across these biological scales very well. So we want to know what climate change means for species, geographic distributions, and survival. Those are actually emergent patterns from a complex system. And a consistent lesson from complex system science is that those emergent patterns typically cannot be inferred simply from the behavior of their components. And so understanding requires both working up from the small scale details and mechanisms, as well as down from those emergent patterns to understand how processes work across scales. So one of the earlier efforts to pull many of these threads together was actually motivated by this seemingly unrelated question: how easily can animals cross mountain passes? And Dan Jansen's answer had a lot to do with this graph, where we've got seasonality plotted on the vertical axis, it's just the standard deviation of monthly temperatures, and latitude on the x-axis from the southern hemisphere on the left, equator in the middle, northern hemisphere on the right. So seasonality is high towards the poles, but low at the equator. And as Jansen conjectured, species that have evolved in the tropics can only tolerate a narrow range of temperatures. And so moving over a cold mountain pass will be relatively more difficult. Mountain passes are in effect, quote unquote, higher in the tropics. So Josh Tewksbury and colleagues then turned this around to argue that tropical ectotherms are also the most sensitive to future warming, again, because they have a narrow tolerance range. And this has been quite a provocative idea. It's sparked plenty of ongoing research. But note, this is just a discussion across latitudes on land. So let's now dip our heads under the ocean surface. It's an environment with strikingly different physical conditions, evolutionary history, geographic patterns, even histories of human interactions. And these contrasts provide a fascinating opportunity to test ecological and evolutionary theory, as well as to understand how the impacts of climate change play out across very different ecosystems. So throughout the rest of my talk, I want to explore some of these differences. So just as sort of introduction, on one level, we're talking about very deep diversity in the ocean, 33 animal phyla compared to 12 on land. Species in these environments also live in very different fluids. So the specific heat of water is higher than air, so it takes more energy to heat up a gram of water than it does a gram of air. The ocean is also rather big, 1.3 sextillion liters to be somewhat precise. So one consequence is shown on this graph here, Again, we've got seasonality on that vertical axis across latitudes on the horizontal axis. The land surface in green I showed you before, and now we've got the ocean surface in blue. So we see that seasonality at sea is low at the equator, rises towards higher latitudes, but drops again at the poles. So it's a qualitatively different pattern in the ocean, but also variation is 6 times less on average in the ocean, at the ocean surface than on land. So there are also fewer microclimates in the ocean, less spatial variation in temperature. On land, it's relatively easy for an organism to move into the sun or the shade and change body temperatures, but there are fewer opportunities for that in the ocean. Also, interesting differences in abundance. So apparently the domesticated chicken is the most abundant vertebrate on land. We like to eat them. Some people like to dress them in sweaters, as shown in this photo. But apparently there are 20 billion chickens around the world. So that's a lot, but it's actually nothing in comparison to certain species of mesopelagic fishes that are 4 orders of magnitude more abundant. High abundance also has implications for evolution. Natural selection should be relatively more effective and genetic drift quite weak. The last sort of overarching point that I want to make is that while many of us find it easier to run than to swim, for organisms evolved in these environments, it's actually quite a bit easier to swim a given distance than to run a given distance. These figures show that it takes 8 times more energy to run the same distance than it does to swim. A lot of it has to do with buoyancy. So what do these differences mean for the impacts of climate change and global change in the ocean? What are the important ecological and evolutionary processes, and how do they compare to what we see on land? So that's what my research group focuses on, the ecology and evolution of global change in the sea. And I also want to say that the research I'll be talking about today wouldn't be possible without the hard work and collaboration of many in this photo over the last few years. I've been especially excited about the opportunity to engage undergraduates in research from a diversity of backgrounds. I think those early research experiences are a really important way to foster inclusion in the sciences. So today, I just want to focus on 4 main questions. First, how does sensitivity to warming differ across terrestrial and marine species? Do any differences in sensitivity scale up to differences in population responses? How do these changes affect biodiversity at a community level? And how might conservation and fisheries adapt to these changes that are happening and are going to continue happening? So on this first question, it's useful to think in terms of a thermal performance curve that maps out how fitness varies across temperature, especially for ectotherms. We have the minimum temperature it can survive, as well as an upper thermal limit. And the specific physiological mechanisms can differ among species, but often involve the relative rates of metabolism compared to oxygen and food supplies, as well as protein structures and membrane fluidity. And then thermal safety is then defined as a metric for an organism's tolerance for further warming. So it's the difference between the body temperature an organism experiences and that upper physiological limit. So to compare marine and terrestrial thermal safety margins, we can first focus on this upper limit. In collaboration with Jennifer Sunday and others, we compiled data from physiological studies detailing upper limits for nearly 320 species on land and 90 species in the ocean, focusing in particular on adult data and accounting for differences in experimental conditions like acclimation temperatures. And plotting all of those data points on 2 graphs, we've got land on the left, ocean on the right. We've got that upper physiological thermal limit is the vertical axis, again across latitudes on the 2 x-axes. Individual species are a dot, and then the smooth fit is from a generalized additive mixed effects model. And just one of the broad patterns we see is that there's this relatively greater drop in that upper physiological tolerance at high latitudes in the ocean compared to what we see on land. It actually mirrors pretty well the drop in the extreme high temperatures in the ocean as well. So the other part of a thermal safety margin, though, is body temperature. And we actually know it's not the average body temperature.
So much. Fuck.
Is there either someone's trying to ask a question or there's someone who just unmuted themselves by accident? We know it's not the average that's most important, but the extreme high temperatures that are most stressful and problematic So what I'm about to show you, we focused on the extreme high temperatures that an organism is likely to experience in each location. So calculating body temperatures on land is a little tricky. It often isn't the same as air temperatures because solar radiation, convection from wind, conduction to the surface are all important, as well as behavior and an organism's ability to seek refuge in cooler parts of the landscape. So what I'm about to show you, therefore, are calculations from a microclimate model run hourly for 20 years for a shady habitat at the location each animal was collected. So what we find is shown here in orange, each of the dots for the individual calculations, again, smooth fit as the line. So those are extreme high body temperatures in the shade across latitudes. If we zoom in though, we see some interesting patterns. In particular, there seem to be two peaks in these body temperatures across latitudes. The black line here is the best fit. Then the gray lines are samples from the parameter uncertainty of that fit. And if we count up how many peaks each of those samples from the uncertainty has, we see though that nearly all of them have two peaks. And this histogram shows how many had 1, 2, 3, or 4 peaks. Similarly, we can identify where those peaks occur. And we actually see that they're above and below the equator rather than right at it. In other words, the hottest hours are actually at intermediate latitudes. It's where long summer days heat up the most and also where low humidity allows for larger swings in temperature over the course of a day. We see similar patterns with two peaks on either side of the equator when we look at upper thermal tolerance limits as well, which I think is really interesting. It suggests that the latitudinal patterns of extreme temperatures are also reflected in those upper thermal limits that ectotherms have evolved. For marine species, it's quite a bit easier. Convection and conduction are very rapid processes. Ectotherm body temperatures are quite similar to water temperatures. So now we can plot upper thermal limits in black, extreme high body temperatures in orange for both terrestrial and marine species. It's the difference between these two for each species that allows us to calculate thermal safety margins. So this plot here now shows thermal safety margins. That's the vertical axis, again across latitudes on the x-axis. We have terrestrial species in green, marine in blue, dots are the species, average across latitudes is the line. And there are two key takeaways that I see. First, on average, we actually see the slimmest thermal safety on land. We see the slimmest thermal safety on land, not at the equator, but at 20 to 30 degrees north and south, suggesting actually that it's these species, not those at the equator, that are most sensitive to further warming. The second key takeaway that I see is that there's, across all latitudes, there's less thermal safety in the ocean than we see on land. There are also interesting questions about what's going to happen going forward. We actually see, going forward, we see slightly more warming of extreme high temperatures on land than we do in the ocean. Terrestrial species also have relatively greater ability to acclimate to changes in temperature from other work that's been done. And yet, if we project forward thermal safety margins towards the end of the century, we still see, in this case using a high greenhouse gas emission scenario, less thermal safety for marine species across latitudes. Suggesting that one of the key points is that marine species are more sensitive to warming than our animals on land when we look at this individual organismal level and account for physiological tolerance, acclimation, and behavior. So the other question is, do these differences in sensitivity scale up to differences in population responses? So if we start out simply thinking about a population spread across latitudes, we have one range edge that's warm, the other that's cold. Then we go back to the range of mechanisms species use to cope with thermal variation. And it's the set of processes that allow a species to persist in place, like tolerance, behavior, acclimation, evolution, that are all important for determining whether that warm range edge persists in place or whether it contracts poleward when the environment warms. So given what I just showed you about the sensitivity of marine species to warming, we might hypothesize that range contractions are more common in marine species. The question is, are they? So I just want to start out with an example from the Northeast US continental shelf. So we've got Nova Scotia up at the top of the map, Dalhousie right on the edge. New York City is down in the middle. Rutgers is just a little bit south, or about 45 minutes south of New York City. And then North Carolina is down at the bottom. It's a 1,200 kilometer section of span of ocean. And in red, I'm showing, this map shows places with high density of a relatively common species, longhorn sculpin in 1968. It's recorded by an ecological survey from the National Marine Fisheries Service. Areas in blue had no sculpin. And what we see is that in the late 60s, that southern range limit was off Virginia. But by 2017, that range limit had contracted north to New York, about 300 kilometers in nearly 50 years. To understand whether these are, how general these patterns are across the two realms, we then pulled all data we could find from the literature on resurveys of warm range edges in ectothermic animals, looking specifically at studies that had multiple species and that reported both stationary and moving range edges, so as to limit publication biases. So for the 100 or so marine species, in this data set, about half had contracted to higher latitudes, while only a quarter had on land. And we can also examine potential differences and account for things like taxonomic similarity among species, the latitude of the range edges, the duration between the resurveys, methodological considerations like how frequently these surveys are conducted. And yet we do see that marine species were significantly more likely to contract poleward in this data set. On the other hand, one potential explanation is just that marine species are more mobile and they move around more. So maybe it's just sort of a stochastic probability, whether they're there or not. On the other hand, if we trim just to the 67 or so marine species with low adult mobility, we see that a bit over half of the species, even of those low mobility species, contracted towards the poles, suggesting that population extirpation is playing an important role here, not just adults moving around. So, we're seeing more frequent extirpations at that warm range edge in the ocean, but whether or not that leads to species level extinction depends on what happens at that other range edge. In other words, does range expansion occur fast enough to offset losses at the trailing edge? And so that brings us to the other key set of processes by which organisms cope with temperature variation. And on this front, it's interesting, marine species actually seem to be doing pretty well. So if we again go to a literature survey, but now looking just at marine species and differentiating between that warm or trailing edge and the leading or cold edge, this figure shows the fraction of species that are shifting their range edges towards cooler latitudes in blue, and the fraction that aren't in gray or red. And what we see is that those warm range edge contractions appear for about 40% of edges, but an even larger fraction of those cold range edges are expanding in the same direction. And I think one thing this emphasizes is that ocean warming is not always bad news for species, and for some species it can also be quite an opportunity. Looking at a literature survey, though, has quite a few limitations. It's a pretty crude approach where you're just sort of calculating, looking at shifts in terms of yes, no, rather than as a rate. So it's a big reason, one of the big reasons that my research group has also focused extensively on pulling together a continent scale set of ecological surveys for North America that span the last half century. These surveys are illustrated by these red polygons here from the Bering Sea and the subarctic down to the subtropical Gulf of Mexico, all the way up to Newfoundland and even Labrador in the Atlantic. So these are bottom trawl surveys conducted every year or so by the National Marine Fisheries Service, as well as the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and their partners. This photo shows the back deck of a survey vessel. You drop a large net off the back, drag it near the bottom, and then count and weigh the species they pull up. And it's everything from familiar species like rockfish and lobster and a wide range of other species like whelks and sea anemones. And they provide a fantastic data set to understand how species and communities have changed through time and space, rivaling in many ways the kinds of data we have available for species on land. So we can use these surveys to compare not just whether or not leading and trailing edges are shifting, but also how fast. So here we're looking across 43 species of fishes in the Northeast US. rate of shift is on the y-axis, either for trailing edges on the left or leading edges on the right. And if we look at the average rates of leading and trailing edges in the Northeast US, we find that those leading cold edges are expanding about 80% faster than the trailing or warm edges are contracting. Besides rate, however, there's also really interesting and important variation among species in the direction they shift. So this is just one example from the Gulf of Alaska for the harlequin rockfish. The circle shows the center of the distribution in 1984. Tip of the arrow shows the center in 2011. So it's a shift of 700 kilometers in 27 years. On the other hand, spiny dogfish over the same period of time barely shifted at all. Though across many fishes and invertebrates that are caught in this particular bottom trawl survey, we see even more variety. If we zoom out then, we see lots of variation not only within regions, but also across regions of North America. Each small colored arrow in this case is a species, the large black arrows in each region is the average across species. And this wide variation is a lot like with what's been reported for species in many other data sets, especially those on land, trees, birds, mammals. You know, one possible explanation is that there's just very, very idiosyncratic responses of each species to changes in climate. It depends on species interactions and precise tolerances for their environment. It's also important, though, to consider the spatial context of each species and population. And so climate velocity, which is the shift of isotherms, is one method for doing that. So let me just take a minute to explain what I mean. So if you imagine a temperature gradient, warm at the bottom of the slide, cold up at the top, and you pick a particular temperature, you draw that temperature as a line on a map, that's an isotherm. Then as temperature is warm, that isotherm moves in a particular direction at a particular speed, expressed in terms of kilometers per decade. It's a combination of speed and direction that we call climate velocity. But the importance of spatial context becomes clear if we compare a gradual spatial gradient of temperatures, like I just demonstrated, with a steep gradient, as I'm illustrating here on the left. And on a steep gradient, isotherms don't move as far or as fast for the same amount of warming. And this is going to become important later when we compare east and west coasts of North America. So just sort of file that away for the end. In addition, the direction of the spatial gradient matters a lot as well. So in a place like the Gulf of Alaska, cooler water is to the southwest. So warming means that isotherms shift to the south and west as the ocean heats up. So a number of years ago, Boris, others, and I all compared species shifts measured as from the centroids, shown here on the vertical axis in degrees latitude per year, against climate velocity here on the x-axis, again in degrees latitude per year. So each dot here is one of the taxa from a bottom trawl survey around North America. And in this particular figure, the red line is actually not a best fit line, it's a one-to-one line. So it would be where taxa would fall if they followed climate velocity perfectly. Clearly they don't, which makes sense given how many factors influence changes in species ranges, including both direct and indirect effects of temperature change. But it's also striking that we can explain close to 40% of the variation across species based on climate velocity. So just suggesting that spatial mosaic of velocities is also very important. These are shifts across latitude. We do a similar plot, but across depth. We can again explain some variation across species, though in this case, not as much. We can also answer a related question, which is whether populations lag behind climate change, climate velocity, I mean. And by noting that species in this lower right quadrant aren't shifting north as fast as climate velocity, measured as the difference from the one-to-one line. These over here aren't shifting south as fast as we would expect, and these are actually speeding ahead. So we can show all those differences as a histogram, either speeding ahead or lagging behind. And we actually don't see evidence that marine animals on average are lagging behind. We've looked pretty hard at traits that might be associated with lagging behind, and there's some small effect that more slowly growing species are more likely to be lagging behind, but the effect is quite small. I think what's more striking is that this result contrasts so much with the evidence that's coming out on land. Wide range of species from mammals to butterflies to birds, plants, and trees all appear to be lagging behind climate velocities. And, at least in my mind, there are two key processes that explain these differences. One, dispersal is relatively easier in the ocean, mobility is greater, fewer barriers to dispersal, so that range expansion can happen faster. But also that sensitivity at the trailing edge and low thermal safety margins, such that marine range contractions are also happening more frequently and faster as temperatures warm, or as temperatures change for that matter. So the take-home message is that marine populations are responding rapidly to temperature changes, especially through these processes of extirpation and range expansion. That these responses are often happening faster than for species on land. So how do these changes sort of scale up to affect biodiversity at a community or assemblage level? So one expectation is that warming would allow warm water species in as new environmental niches become available, and push cold water species out, or vice versa when it's cooling. And one way to measure that is just as the average temperature preference of the species in a community and how that changes through time. It's something that's often been called the community temperature index. So each species temperature is usually measured as the midpoint of their realized thermal niche in this particular case. So in collaboration with Mike Burrows and others, one of the things we've done is look at empirical trends across marine fishes in both North America and Europe. So these are bottom trawl surveys, as I've shown you earlier, that are now expanded to include similar data sets in Europe. And we see quite a bit of variety in terms of assemblages either reorganizing towards cool water species, those are the blue grid cells, or towards those being dominated by warm water species in red. We've also looked at plankton data from the continuous plankton recorder, shown here on the right. And again, there's substantial variation between some that are cooling, some regions that are cooling, and some that are warming. In terms of the assemblage composition, this is trends in community temperature index. And what's interesting is that some of this variation in community change mirrors variation in ocean temperature change. So here we have rate of change in ocean temperature on the x-axis in degrees Celsius per year, warming on the right, cooling on the left, and rate of change in community temperature index on the y-axis. So we see this reorganization towards warm water species where the ocean is warming, and reorganization towards cool water species where the ocean is cooling. On one level, it's pretty amazing to see these broad scale patterns at an assemblage level, given how complex community dynamics can be. Even with that relationship though, there's a lot of variation, which is important to dig into. So one of the key patterns we see is that there's a faster response in community composition. So that's the y-axis, faster up at the top, slower down at the bottom, in areas with greater thermal diversity of species, which is the y-axis. We measure that as the weighted standard deviation of the species in the assemblage. So what this is saying is that in more thermally diverse assemblages, we have plenty of new species ready to increase in abundance or move in when conditions change, but also plenty of existing species near the limits of their thermal niches, ready to decrease in abundance or even to be extirpated when conditions change. In a much more homogeneous assemblage, there's little opportunity for turnover of community composition in that way. Species are responding much more similarly. So in contrast, we see slower change in assemblage composition in areas where thermal refugia are more available. So down here, which in this case we're measuring as the vertical temperature difference between the surface and the temperature at 50-meter depth. So in other words, when species can move a short distance to cooler water, it looks like they're more likely to stick around even when the ocean warms up. So the take-home message here is that when we scale up to entire communities, we're seeing predictable changes in community composition, though with plenty of variation that depends on characteristics of the community and the species that are there, as well as their spatial context, like refugia. So finally, I want to touch on some of the implications for conservation and for people. As I've been showing you, many marine species are shifting poleward. Some are shifting deeper as well. These red arrows in this map show how much more species are likely to shift in each region by 2100 under a high greenhouse gas emission scenario. Low scenario in blue, and it's substantially less. So under high greenhouse gas emissions, though, it's about roughly 350 kilometers further on the east coast of North America, but about 1,000 kilometers further on the west coast. And a lot of this comes back to oceanography. We have this steep thermal gradient on the east coast driven by divergence of the Gulf Stream, but a gradual thermal gradient on the west coast from the Alaska and California currents. So that means we expect actually slower climate velocities on the east coast and more rapid velocities on the west coast, going back to my earlier introduction of climate velocity action. The thing is, most conservation efforts aren't set up with this future in mind. And most fisheries management as well is either implicitly or explicitly based on the assumption that species don't move around like this. And so this map shows in green both marine protected areas and various forms of spatial fisheries management zones around North America. And one of the consequences of species on the move is that there will be substantial turnover in the species within each of these management zones. So calculations based on looking at future locations of marine species habitats suggest that about 30% of species would be lost under a high greenhouse gas emissions scenario from existing spatial management zones in North America, though actually less than 10% under a low greenhouse gas emissions scenario. Those species, though, in these temperate latitudes are expected to be replaced by about the same fraction of new species that aren't currently there. So there are a couple ways to think about adapting to these changes from a conservation or management perspective. One is to move spatial zones around, so this idea of dynamic ocean management. And I think that can work especially well for certain kinds of fishery management zones or zones focused on a small number of species. But it gets more difficult for spatial areas or protected areas that are set up for a wide range of species, or when there's a need to coordinate across many different sectors of the economy, many different user groups. So another suggestion has been to set up networks, sort of as stepping stones. Species might move out of one, but then move into another one somewhere else. And a big question has been whether that's possible and even feasible. You know, the coastal ocean is filled with many different human uses, and in this crowded seascape, many governments have realized that they need to set aside specific areas for specific uses to coordinate and avoid conflicts. And that's often called marine spatial planning or ocean planning. Goes by different names, but this map from Belgium just shows one example. Areas were set aside for bird conservation, for sand mining, for wind energy, for aquaculture. But there are efforts like this ongoing at this point on every continent. And in the context, though, of shifting species, is there a benefit to planning ahead for climate change with just static management areas? Or if that is feasible, are there strong trade-offs? Is there going to be a strong cost to doing that? So to try to answer that question, the approach we've taken is basically to simulate the ocean planning process. And so to do that, we set goals for what an ocean plan might accomplish, like setting aside fishing areas that allow catching at least half the biomass for the dominant fishery species in a region, conservation areas that include 10% of the range for each species, for which we have data, wind or wave development areas that include 10% of the net present value of these energy sources. And so given the data we have on where these resources are now, we can then solve that actually planning problem in an algorithm called integer linear programming, and make a plan that works well based on where resources are now. And we end up with a map, something like this. So we've got fishing areas in blue, conservation areas in red, energy areas in green. And then we can test that sort of hypothetical plan against projections of where species might be in the future. We can then reevaluate the plan against the same goals that we set. So fisheries goals, conservation goals, energy goals. And in this case, just to be clear, each species is a goal in this tally. But only the fishing and the conservation goals are sensitive to species on the move. And we do this not just for sort of one potential future, but also a wide range of potential futures, low and a high greenhouse gas emission scenarios, so RPC 2.6 and 8.5, as well as 8 different climate models. And one of the things we see is that a plan based only on where species are now will be less likely to meet planning goals in the future. And this graph captures that decline. We've got year on the x-axis out to the end of the century, and the fraction of goals met on the y-axis. And we've done this not just for the Canadian Maritimes, but for 9 regions around North America. And we see pretty congruent patterns in each region. So these declining goals met as species move. But what if we back up and actually make a more intentionally proactive plan? One that considers not just where species are now, but where they may be in the future. We do this here in actually quite a simple way. We're just using one set of projections of species distributions and including those future distributions also as goals in the planning process. I should say that the projections we're using for planning are separate from those used for testing. They're a completely separate set of climate models to avoid circularity. Again, we solve this with integer linear programming. And the first thing I want to show you is that these plans are quite different if we include information on where species are likely to be in the future. So the y-axis in this graph shows the fraction of planning grid cells that change between the present-only plan and this proactive plan. It's about 20%, but it varies between each of the 9 regions, which are each of those bars. One of the concerns, though, is that a plan that works for the future is going to restrict activity across a much larger area of the ocean. You've got to protect the important areas now and the important areas in the future, and it's just going to end up filling the whole seascape. In effect, we've doubled the number of goals the algorithm is trying to meet, actually. But that's actually not what we see. So this bar plot shows the fraction of planning zone, either in the present-only plan on the left, and the proactive plan on the right. And we show the fraction of the zone that's in conservation at the bottom, in fishing, the next bit above, in energy, the bit above that, and then the lightest area at the top is just free, not zoned at all. And what we see is that in this particular example from the Eastern Bering Sea, we see a very slight increase in the area set aside for fishing when we move from present only to this more proactive plan. Across all the 9 regions, we see on average a 2% increase in the zoned regions. So quite a small increase. And yet we see that these proactive plans are consistently better at meeting ocean planning goals through time. So that's the purple lines in this graph rather than these orange lines. What's interesting is that in many regions, at least, they're also better even over the next couple decades. So when climate variability rather than climate change really is the dominant factor. And suggests that even long-term planning for species on the move can be very beneficial for accounting for species on the move over just decadal timescales as well. By setting, basically what's happened is that these plans have put conservation and fishing zones along gradients of temperature and depth so that species move out of one and move into another one somewhere else. So it suggests that planning for species on the move can provide substantial benefits and impose relatively few costs. I think that's exciting. The planning exercise I just showed, though, suggests that adapting now to climate change is feasible, but the analysis largely focuses on how people impact ocean ecosystems. At the same time, we know that ecosystem changes strongly affect human behavior. In other words, the coastal ocean is a strongly coupled social ecological system. So in my own research, I've been studying these dynamics in collaboration with geographers, anthropologists, and economists. And just to show you one small example, this map from the mid-Atlantic east coast of the US shows with a red square where large fishing trawlers from Beaufort, North Carolina, which is the Black Diamond, shows where they were fishing in the mid-1990s. These are from vessel trip reports that fishers submit. By 2014, though, the boats were going all the way up to New Jersey, about 1,000 kilometers round trip, to catch summer flounder that had shifted north. And this shift in the species and in fishing has also started to drive quite a conflict among states over who should get access to this resource, which I'll come back to. These are interesting questions. Another consequence, though, of species on the move is that it changes the availability of species to different communities of fishers. To balance out things, I want to show you a West Coast example in this case, that we could show similar things for the East Coast. In this case, the black line shows the overall biomass of an important rockfish species called short-spine thorny head. And the black line shows that the biomass has declined in US waters. But the gray line shows how the location of thorny head has fluctuated north and south, including a recent southward shift. And if we then intersect the abundance and distribution of thorny head with the ocean area fished from each of these 8 communities on the west coast of the US, as the biomass and location of thorny head has changed, Astoria, an important fishing port, has relatively lost out. They have less availability. And yet, a port very nearby, Coos Bay, has actually seen an increase in availability of thorny head over the recent decades. So these kinds of changes in availability can have far-reaching consequences. New York State in the US has actually filed a lawsuit over shifting summer flounder. And now, more than a decade ago, what were called the mackerel wars broke out between European Union and Iceland over mackerel that had shifted into Icelandic waters. And the two parties couldn't agree how to share the fishery, led to overfishing, and actually then spilled over into a trade war. And I think the general message from a lot of the work we've been doing in this area is that fisheries moving across political boundaries often cause conflict. We're not ready for fisheries on the move in particular. But how much of a problem is this likely to be? So this map shows the results from coupling species distribution models to climate change projections. And each area in red shows an exclusive economic zone likely to experience at least one new fishery crossing an international boundary by 2100. And we see that they're spread all over the world, suggesting this is a rapidly growing issue. It also suggests a real need for better and more widely available tools to help people in public policy adapt to species on the move. One small step that we've taken is to develop the Ocean Adapt website in partnership with DFO and NOAA Fisheries. And we prepare and serve up maps and other indicators of past and future marine animal distributions and how they have and are likely in the future to change. It's a website that's helped inform fisheries management decisions, climate vulnerability assessments, even investigative journalism, lesson plans, and a documentary film. It also is actually a national climate indicator for the US federal government as well. And we currently serve data and maps for each of the regions shown here with a red pin, including Scotian Shelf in Canada, but are now actually just this year expanding to other regions of Canada in partnership with CFO, really to help focus on these transboundary management questions. So given the rapid changes we've already seen in the ocean, I think the next several decades are going to be a key time for determining what happens to marine ecosystems. And a key challenge for many scientists is whether we can bring science to bear on these questions to help society make informed choices going forward. So I think I see sort of 2 key research issues, and then I will wrap up. Does that sound good?
That's good. Yep, all good.
Okay, sounds good. I just heard someone on there. So
make sure you get the right one. There are 3.
Sounds like someone's unmuted. So first issue I see is just better understanding the community impacts of climate change. Which of these impacts are just unmuting myself, Boris, I hope that's okay. Which of those impacts are generalizable across ecosystems and across realms? Why, for example, are some communities changing composition faster, others more slowly? And how do transient dynamics influence these responses through time? I've shown you some initial research today, but there's a lot more to do, and that's something we're just starting to dig into with data sets both on land and in the ocean. Second, I also think we need a much better understanding for when and where rapid evolution can help species cope with global change. How does it work? Which species are most likely to evolve? Can we facilitate these responses to aid conservation? And the approach that we've been taking is in effect to try to rewind time by DNA sequencing historical samples, reconstruct genomic composition of a population to test if evolution actually happened and to understand which genes are under selection. Okay, just to wrap up and summarize, if we go back to that sort of think about how species cope with environmental variation. We saw a synthesis of physiological data suggesting that marine ectotherms are more sensitive to warming than our animals on land. A half-century of ecological surveys suggesting that marine populations respond rapidly to temperature variation, particularly through range expansion and contraction, and often faster than what we see on land. Long-term data sets revealed that community composition changes, in many cases, predictably when temperature changes, but mediated in important ways by thermal diversity and refugia. And last, I showed you how fishing behavior is already adapting to shifting species, how this is causing conflicts, but also how we have some practical tools for starting to adapt to these changes now and going forward, including a network approach to ocean planning. So throughout this talk, I've compared and contrasted climate impacts on land and at sea, and the same ecological and evolutionary processes are at work. And yet the strategies that species use, the outcomes for populations and communities differ in important ways. And I think comparisons between these realms is a really rich source of insight, both now and